24th of May, 1941. Denmark Strait. The fog hung thick over cold water. On the bridge of HMS Hood, officers studied charts marked with pencil tracks. Radio traffic crackled with sighting reports. British commanders expected a textbook gunnery duel at medium range, where armor and training would decide the outcome. The reality arrived at 05:52, when German shells began falling with unnerving accuracy. Within 8 minutes, Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, exploded and sank, taking 1,418 men with her. Only 3 survived. The shock reverberated to London within hours. Churchill's order was immediate and absolute. Sink the Bismarck. What followed was not the expected surface action, but a 74-hour pursuit spanning 3,000 nautical miles, decided not by battleship guns but by a single torpedo from a fabric-covered biplane. One weapon designed in the previous war would prove that the age of the battleship had already passed. Hamburg, Germany, August 1940. An inspection party moved past the massive gun turrets of the newly commissioned battleship. Yard logs recorded the final displacement, 41,700 tons standard, climbing to 50,900 tons at full combat load. The main battery mounted 8 38-centimeter SK C-34 guns, each capable of hurling an 800-kilogram armor-piercing shell at velocities exceeding 700 meters per second at medium range. The belt armor measured 320 millimeters thick, backed by layered deck protection reaching 110 millimeters over the magazines. Internal torpedo bulkheads added further protection. Stereoscopic rangefinders integrated with new SeaTac radar systems enabled rapid spotting corrections that earlier ships could not match. Admiral Erich Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, envisioned Bismarck as a commerce raider, a ship powerful enough to destroy convoy escorts but fast enough to avoid decisive fleet actions. The strategic calculation was clear. Britain's Atlantic lifeline depended on merchant shipping. A single battleship loose among the convoys could force the Royal Navy to disperse its capital ships across vast ocean areas, weakening coverage everywhere. The endurance figures supported the plan: 8,800 nautical miles at cruising speed, with over 7,000 tons of fuel oil aboard. Vice Admiral Gunther Lütjens, appointed to command Operation Reinebung, received his sailing directive in May 1941. The orders authorized Atlantic raiding but emphasized strict avoidance of unnecessary risk to the ship. Captain Ernst Lindemann commanded Bismarck itself, responsible for the vessel and its 2,200-man crew. The pre-sailing briefings stressed stealth and speed. The ship would slip through the northern passages, refuel from tankers in the Atlantic, and disappear among the convoy routes. German naval staff expected Bismarck to vanish into the immensity of the North Atlantic. British forces, they calculated, could not possibly cover every approach or search every sector. The mathematics of ocean warfare favored the raider. A fast battleship with good intelligence could choose when and where to engage, attacking weak escorts and fleeing when heavy units appeared. The fuel reserves and mechanical reliability made extended operations feasible. The armor and armament made any but the heaviest British ships vulnerable. Reality would prove different. High survivability and long range made Bismarck a strategic asset so valuable that its mere presence would compel Britain to concentrate overwhelming force. The leverage the Germans sought worked in reverse. Churchill could not afford to leave such a threat at large. A vessel designed to disappear would be detected within hours of leaving the Baltic, tracked by neutral observers, hunted by reconnaissance aircraft, and engaged by every available capital ship in the Atlantic theater. The ship's dimensions told the story of German engineering ambition. Length overall, 251 meters. Beam, 36 meters. Draft at full load, 9.3 meters. The propulsion system generated 150,000 shaft horsepower through 3 Brown Boveri-geared turbines, driving 3 propellers. 12 Wagner high-pressure boilers fed the system. Maximum speed exceeded 30 knots in trials. The crew spaces, fire control stations, and ammunition handling rooms represented years of design refinement. But numbers alone could not change the strategic balance. Britain operated 8 capital ships in the Atlantic theater. Germany had 2 modern battleships, Bismarck and her sister Tirpitz, still completing workup in Baltic waters. Every other German heavy unit sat in dock for repairs or refitting after earlier combat damage. The material imbalance meant Britain could afford to mass forces without leaving critical areas exposed. German planners understood this reality but hoped that speed, stealth, and luck would allow Bismarck to operate long enough to justify the risk. Gotenhafen, modern-day Gdynia, 18th of May 1941. The sailing board listed two ships, Bismarck and the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen. Together they would execute the breakout into the Atlantic. Swedish coastal observers filed routine reports as the formation passed through the Kattegat on the 19th and 20th of May. These reports, transmitted through neutral diplomatic channels, reached London within 24 hours. First Sea Lord Admiral Sir Dudley Pound reviewed the intelligence summaries on the morning of the 20th. Commander-in-Chief Home Fleet Admiral Sir John Tovey ordered increased reconnaissance patrols of the northern passages within hours of receiving the warning. German command expected to pass the Denmark Strait gap unobserved. Spring fog and limited British patrol resources should have provided adequate cover. Instead, neutral observation combined with British signals intelligence created early strategic warning. The Admiralty War Room diary entry for the 19th of May noted, "Suspect Bismarck bound for Atlantic." All patrols alerted the fusion of scattered reports. A Swedish sighting here, a radio intercept there, an unusual pattern of German air reconnaissance, built a picture that narrowed the search area dramatically. The numbers told the story of material imbalance. Britain maintained approximately 8 capital ships in commission across the Atlantic theater. Germany had only 2 modern battleships operational, Bismarck and her sister Tirpitz, still working up in the Baltic. Every other German heavy unit was in dock for repairs or refitting after earlier operations. This numerical superiority meant Britain could afford to concentrate multiple task forces without leaving other theaters dangerously exposed. Tovey began repositioning forces even before Bismarck's exact route was confirmed on the 21st of May. Speed became the critical factor in positioning. Bismarck could make 30 knots in good conditions. The British heavy units varied significantly. Hood could match that speed. King George V and Prince of Wales were comparable at 28 to 29 knots, but older battleships like Rodney topped out around 23 knots. Positioning had to account for these differences. Fast ships would shadow and engage if contact was made. Slower units would position ahead on likely tracks toward the Atlantic, cutting off potential escape routes. Fuel calculations dominated British planning at every level. Crossing the North Atlantic at 20 to 25 knots consumed enormous quantities of oil. Replenishment constraints limited how long British ships could maintain high-speed pursuit without returning to harbor. German planners understood this limitation and incorporated it into their breakout strategy. If Bismarck could evade contact for 48 hours, British searchers would begin reaching their turnaround points, forced back to harbor by empty bunkers and the need to refuel. The hunters relied on radar technology and the gaps in weather patterns. The hunted relied on speed and strict radio silence. Both sides knew that initial contact would come from light forces, cruisers on patrol sweeps, perhaps a lucky reconnaissance aircraft. The decisive question was whether those light forces could maintain contact long enough for heavy units to close the distance and bring the German battleship to action. British cruisers HMS Norfolk and HMS Suffolk began their patrol patterns in the Denmark Strait on the 22nd of May. The strait, between Iceland and Greenland, represented one of only 2 practical routes for a German breakout into the North Atlantic. The other route, between Iceland and Scotland, had heavier coverage but offered more room to maneuver. German planners chose the Denmark Strait, betting that fog and ice would provide concealment. Denmark Strait, 24th of May 1941, 05:35. The heavy cruisers HMS Norfolk and HMS Suffolk had been shadowing the German formation through the night using radar. At first light, Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland aboard HMS Hood increased speed to close and engage. HMS Prince of Wales followed in line astern, maintaining formation. Holland's battle orders called for a close-range action that would reduce the risk of plunging fire penetrating Hood's deck armor, which was thinner than the belt armor. The approach angle, however, initially exposed the British ships to long-range fire while their own after-turrets could not bear on the target. Opening range was approximately 25,000 yards, nearly 14 statute miles. German fire control systems demonstrated their effectiveness immediately. Bismarck's fourth salvo straddled Hood at 0552, meaning shells landed on both sides of the target, the classic indicator of accurate range finding. The range was closing rapidly as both formations steamed toward each other at combined speeds exceeding 50 knots. Prince Eugen's war diary would later record observing large flame from the British flagship during the engagement. Hood opened fire at 0552 and 30 seconds. Bismarck replied within 30 seconds, demonstrating the readiness and training of her gunnery crews. Prince of Wales, still suffering mechanical problems with her new 14-inch turrets. Several guns were not yet fully operational, engaged shortly after. The gunnery was conducted at ranges where even minor errors in range finding or ballistics calculation meant missing the target entirely. Both sides achieved hits within the first few salvos. Prince of Wales struck Bismarck forward, causing fuel contamination that would prove critical later. German shells struck Hood repeatedly in the opening minutes. At 0559 and 30 seconds, Hood exploded catastrophically. Survivor statements, particularly from ordinary signalman Ted Briggs, one of only 3 men rescued from the icy water, confirmed the devastating nature of the loss. The ship broke in half and sank within 3 minutes of the explosion. Of 1,418 officers and men aboard, 1,415 died in the disaster. The psychological impact was immediate and profound across the Royal Navy and British public. Hood had been the symbol of British naval power for 20 years, the ship shown to visiting dignitaries and foreign heads of state, the most famous warship in the world. The tactical situation became immediately complex. Prince of Wales had scored several hits on Bismarck but suffered multiple mechanical failures in her main battery. At least 2 turrets experienced jams or misfires. She broke off action under orders from Rear Admiral Frederick Wakewalker, who assumed tactical command after Holland's death. The battleship laid smoke and withdrew to a shadowing position. Norfolk and Suffolk resumed their radar tracking role, maintaining contact while staying beyond visual range when possible. German gunnery had proven devastatingly effective at long range. The integration of optical rangefinders and radar-assisted spotting allowed rapid bracketing and accurate fire even in the marginal visibility of the northern waters. British armor and fire control had proven inadequate at the ranges imposed by German radar-directed fire. The loss of Hood validated German confidence in their ship's capabilities, but also triggered the massive British response that would seal Bismarck's fate. The combination of range, angle of fall, and magazine vulnerability had produced catastrophic results for Hood. But those same factors now shaped British response across every level of command. Political will hardened instantly. Hood's loss could not stand unavenged. The blow to British prestige and morale was too severe. Churchill's directive to the Admiralty was unambiguous. Concentrate all available forces and hunt down Bismarck regardless of cost or risk to other operations. The shock of Hood's loss eliminated any hesitation about committing resources. Every capital ship that could steam would join the hunt. Every available aircraft would search. The pursuit became a national imperative. London War Room, 24th of May 1941, afternoon. Signal pads marked most immediate accumulated on plotting tables in the Admiralty Operations Center. The movements board showed multiple forces changing course simultaneously, converging from different positions across the Atlantic. Churchill monitored developments personally from the war room, demanding updates every 30 minutes. First Sea Lord Pound coordinated directly with Tovey at sea. Orders went out to Admiral James Somerville, commanding Force H at Gibraltar. Proceed north at maximum speed with the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, battlecruiser Renown, light cruiser Sheffield, and screening destroyers. German staff had expected British forces to disperse, covering multiple possible tracks and approach routes. Instead, Britain was massing a multi-axis net that included King George V and repulse from the home fleet, Rodney detached from convoy escort duty in mid-Atlantic, Ramillies released from other duties, and Force H driving up from the Mediterranean. RAF Coastal Command tasked long-range Catalina flying boats for oceanic reconnaissance sweeps across the predicted search areas. The effort represented nearly everything Britain could deploy in the Atlantic theater simultaneously, a concentration of force unprecedented in the naval war to that point. Logistics governed the hunt's geometry at every stage. Heavy units crossing the North Atlantic at 20 to 25 knots burned fuel at rates that limited endurance to days, not weeks. Replenishment at sea was difficult, time-consuming, and dangerous in Atlantic weather. Each hour of high-speed steaming consumed tons of precious oil that could not be easily replaced. Tovey's staff calculated fuel states continuously, plotting the advancing curves of depletion against ranges to target areas and distances back to refueling bases. The redeployed forces represented staggering tonnage and firepower. Multiple battleships displacing 30,000 to 40,000 tons each, 2 aircraft carriers, more than a dozen cruisers ranging from 6,000 to 10,000 tons, several destroyer flotillas, all converging on search areas defined by Bismarck's last known position and estimated speed. The concentration reduced German maneuvering options with each passing hour. If Bismarck maintained her course toward the central Atlantic, she would run into converging forces from north and south. If she turned back toward Norway and German-controlled ports, home fleet units blocked that route. The only remaining option was France, where German-occupied ports at Brest and Saint-Nazaire offered drydock facilities capable of handling a ship Bismarck's size. Churchill's minute to the Admiralty crystallized the political dimension. The destruction of HMS Hood must be avenged at once. The loss had shocked the British public and raised uncomfortable questions about naval competence and readiness. Failure to sink Bismarck would compound the disaster and provide Germany with a tremendous propaganda victory. Success would demonstrate British determination and capability under pressure. The hunt became not just a tactical necessity but a political imperative at the highest levels of government. Bismarck slipped radar contact during the night of the 24th to 25th of May. Suffolk lost her in a rain squall while maneuvering to maintain optimal tracking range. For more than 30 hours, British forces searched without success across thousands of square miles of ocean. Tovey altered course based on his assessment of German intentions, but the search area expanded exponentially with each hour of lost contact. But one factor had already changed the strategic calculus. An earlier 14-inch shell from Prince of Wales had struck Bismarck forward, rupturing fuel tanks and contaminating others with seawater. Bismarck was leaving a trail of oil on the surface, a trail that British observers would eventually detect. North Atlantic, 24th to 25th of May 1941. Engine room logs aboard Bismarck recorded continuous pumping operations attempting to manage fuel contamination from battle damage. The hit from Prince of Wales had penetrated the forward tanks on the port side, mixing seawater with fuel oil and rendering approximately 1,000 tons unusable for the propulsion system. Worse, the leak created a visible slick on the ocean surface that watch officers on British cruisers reported as intermittent oil sheens during the few periods when visual contact was maintained. German damage control parties worked continuously through the day and night. The Kriegstagebuch, the official war diary, entry for the 24th to 25th of May noted, leak forward tank unsealed, crew working on pumps. The damage was containable with the ship's internal systems but not reparable at sea without drydock facilities. More critically, the fuel loss and contamination reduced operational radius by hundreds of nautical miles. The mathematics of endurance had shifted decisively against the German operational plan. Vice Admiral Lutyens faced a critical strategic choice. The original plan called for refueling from a prepositioned tanker in the Atlantic, then proceeding to the convoy routes for commerce raiding operations. The fuel damage made that plan impossible. Endurance was now insufficient for extended operations followed by the long return voyage. Bismarck needed a drydock with capacity to handle a ship drawing 9 to 10 meters, the deepest facilities available in German-controlled Europe. Only the French Atlantic ports of Saint-Nazaire and Brest offered such facilities with the specialized equipment needed for major hull repairs. The decision to make for France transformed the tactical situation fundamentally. Instead of disappearing into the vastness of the North Atlantic where British forces would have to search millions of square miles, Bismarck would now steer toward a specific destination within range of British shore-based aircraft and Force H steaming up from Gibraltar. The cone of possible locations narrowed from an expanding circle to a corridor pointing toward the Bay of Biscay. The ship maintained approximately 28 knots despite the damage, with engineering crews attempting to minimize vibration and cavitation from the compromised forward fuel tanks. Fuel consumption at that speed was significant, several tons per hour. Every hour of high-speed transit reduced the available margin for maneuvering, combat, or evasion. The crew understood the implications clearly. A ship designed for extended raiding operations lasting weeks or months had been reduced to a race against fuel exhaustion and converging enemy forces. British cruisers, resuming contact periodically when visibility and range permitted, reported the oil trail to fleet headquarters. Analysts at the Admiralty Operations Center plotted the track and heading. The slick confirmed Bismarck's approximate course and speed even when radar contact was lost in weather or at extended range. What had been a vast search area covering millions of square miles narrowed to a corridor several hundred miles wide pointing toward France. Aircraft could now patrol that corridor with reasonable probability of reacquisition. The engineering damage seemed minor compared to Hood's catastrophic destruction. A single shell hit, some fuel contamination, modest loss of endurance. But that single hit had fundamentally altered the operational picture. A commerce raider needed the freedom to choose when and where to engage, to attack weak targets and flee from strong ones. Damage that forced a specific course and destination eliminated that freedom entirely. Bismarck was no longer hunting convoys. She was being herded toward an increasingly narrow box. A single engineering defect had rerouted a 50,000-ton battleship directly into the envelope of carrier aviation and concentrated surface forces. Bletchley Park, 25th of May 1941. Intercept logs accumulated steadily in Hut 4 and Hut 8, the sections responsible for naval cryptanalysis. The cryptanalysts working on German naval Enigma codes faced continuous challenges. The naval version used different key settings and procedures than Army or Air Force variants. But operational necessities sometimes created exploitable patterns. Luftwaffe coordination messages were often less securely encrypted than Kriegsmarine traffic, using variants that British codebreakers had more success penetrating. Analysts noted increased German air reconnaissance activity directed toward Brittany in northwestern France, not toward Norway or the northern passages. The traffic pattern indicated preparations for providing fighter cover over the Bay of Biscay approaches, a clear suggestion that German naval forces expected operations in that area. The bomb machines, large electromechanical devices designed specifically to crack Enigma settings, ran continuously, testing possible key combinations against intercepted messages. A decoded Luftwaffe message concerning air coverage orders reached the desk of an Operational Intelligence Center analyst on the afternoon of the 25th. The implication was immediately clear. German forces expected Bismarck to approach occupied France, not attempt a return through the Denmark Strait or northern passages back to Germany. Correlation with earlier surface sighting reports and the projected fuel situation after battle damage supported this interpretation strongly. Alan Turing's mathematical workstreams on naval Enigma since 1940 had created the theoretical and practical foundation for breaking German naval codes, though specific daily keys still required extensive analysis of intercepted traffic. Cribbing, using known or suspected message content to deduce key settings, remained essential to the process. Traffic analysis, examining patterns and volumes of transmission rather than actual content, often provided operational intelligence faster than full decryption of individual messages. The Admiralty Appreciation Summary for the 25th of May concluded that air coverage orders implied a French landfall rather than a Norwegian destination. This intelligence allowed Force H steaming north from Gibraltar and Tovey's northern units to adjust courses appropriately, cutting off Bismarck's approach to the Bay of Biscay rather than guarding the northern routes back to German bases. The redirection saved critical hours of steaming time and placed British aircraft carriers where they could reach the target within striking range. Luftwaffe bases within operational range of the anticipated track included major facilities at Brest, Lorient, and other Brittany airfields supporting maritime strike and reconnaissance operations. German expectations of fighter protection over their own ship indicated confidence that Bismarck would reach air cover range within 24 to 36 hours. British planners understood they had a narrow time window. After Bismarck reached range of land-based Luftwaffe fighters, strikes from Ark Royal's aircraft would become prohibitively dangerous due to German air superiority in that zone. The intelligence dimension highlighted the multi-domain nature of the pursuit operation. Surface forces provided contact maintenance and final engagement capability. Aircraft extended reconnaissance range and provided strike capability beyond gun range. Signals intelligence focused the search areas and predicted enemy movements before they occurred. The integration of these three elements, surface, air, and intelligence, represented a fundamentally new form of naval warfare that would define Atlantic operations for the remainder of the war. Intelligence had pointed decisively toward France as Bismarck's destination. Now aircraft would have to actually find the ship in thousands of square miles of ocean, locate her precisely enough for a coordinated strike, and deliver attacks in heavy weather and failing light against formidable anti-aircraft defenses. The mathematical problem had been narrowed from millions to thousands of square miles, but execution remained brutally difficult against a fast, well-defended target. Mid-Atlantic, 26th of May 1941, morning. A Catalina flying boat from 209 Squadron RAF patrolled in heavy seas approximately 400 miles west of Ireland. The aircraft, a PBY-5A model built in the United States, could remain airborne for more than 12 hours at patrol speeds, covering vast search sectors that no surface ship could match. The navigator plotted position continuously, 49 degrees 33 minutes north, 21 degrees 47 minutes west. At approximately 10:30 hours, the crew sighted a large warship matching Bismarck's profile and silhouette, proceeding on course 150 degrees at approximately 18 knots. Flight Lieutenant Dennis Briggs transmitted the contact report immediately using the aircraft's high-frequency radio. The message included precise course, estimated speed, and confirmed position. The signal reached the Admiralty War Room in London within minutes and was relayed simultaneously to Force H and Tovey's pursuing units. Admiral Somerville turned Ark Royal and the accompanying heavy units north at 27 knots, the maximum sustained speed for the formation. Distance time calculations showed intercept was possible, but the window was narrow, perhaps 6 to 8 hours before Bismarck would reach the outer range of Luftwaffe fighter cover from French bases. German belief in oceanic immensity as protection had been countered by Allied persistence with long-range patrol aircraft and coordinated search patterns. The Catalina's endurance made it possible to maintain search patterns over areas measuring hundreds of miles on each side, coverage that surface ships simply could not provide. Fuel consumption and crew fatigue limited each individual patrol to 12 to 14 hours, but rotating aircraft from bases in Iceland, Northern Ireland, and Scotland created continuous coverage of predicted sectors based on intelligence assessments. Bismarck's reduced speed, a consequence of fuel conservation measures and accumulated battle damage effects, worked against her strategic position. At higher speeds approaching 30 knots, the ship might have outrun the pursuing forces or reached Luftwaffe air cover range before surface contact could be reestablished. At 18 knots, the geometry decisively favored the pursuers. Force H could close from the south while Tovey's heavy units, including King George V and Rodney, approached from the northwest. Bismarck was being compressed into a shrinking box of ocean with British forces closing from multiple directions. The contact report triggered immediate coordinated activity across multiple British forces separated by hundreds of miles. Fuel states were recalculated for all major units. Course adjustments were transmitted by radio and flag signal. Ark Royal began preparing her strike aircraft for launch, Swordfish torpedo bombers that would need several hours of preparation, briefing, arming, and launch procedures. The window for daylight attack was already closing. It was late morning on the 26th, and preparations for a late afternoon or evening strike would take most of the remaining daylight hours. If the strike failed or weather prevented launch, surface forces would close during the night for a dawn gunnery engagement on the 27th. The tactical situation now favored coordinated surface-air action of a type rarely attempted in the war to that point. Ark Royal's Swordfish torpedo bombers, obsolete by contemporary standards with fabric-covered airframes and open cockpits, could attack in sea states and weather conditions that grounded more modern aircraft. The low speed and seemingly archaic design that made them anachronisms in the age of modern aviation also made them unexpectedly stable torpedo platforms in heavy weather. An evening strike in failing light and rough seas would actually favor these slow biplanes over faster, more modern torpedo aircraft that required steadier conditions for accurate attack runs. At sea, 26th of May 1941, evening. The flight deck of HMS Ark Royal pitched heavily in the rough seas as the carrier steamed at high speed toward the strike position. 15 Swordfish aircraft were prepared for the attack sortie. Each biplane carried a single 18-inch torpedo weighing approximately 1,700 pounds with a warhead containing over 600 pounds of explosive. Pilots received detailed briefings on identification procedures. An earlier sortie had nearly attacked the British cruiser Sheffield by mistake when weather reduced visibility, a near disaster that emphasized the confusion and danger of twilight naval combat in poor conditions. Lieutenant Commander John Moffett led one of the 3 strike sections. The Swordfish had a maximum speed of less than 100 knots when loaded with a torpedo, slower than many fighters of the previous war. The fabric covering stretched over metal frames, and the open cockpit represented technology that seemed to belong to 1918, not 1941. But that same simplicity and extremely low speed complicated German fire control predictions in ways that designers had never anticipated. Modern anti-aircraft systems calculated future target positions based on velocity and altitude measurements. Against targets moving at 90 knots at near-zero altitude in rough seas with heavy cloud cover, those calculations became unreliable. The strike launched at approximately 1900 hours as daylight faded. Weather was deteriorating steadily, with low clouds at 500 to 1,000 feet and rough seas creating whitecaps and spray. Visibility varied from several miles down to hundreds of yards in rain squalls that swept across the area. The aircraft approached from different sectors in 3 groups, forcing Bismarck's defensive fire control to divide attention and track multiple threats simultaneously, a standard tactical doctrine for coordinated strikes. German 10.5 cm and 3.7 cm anti-aircraft mounts engaged at maximum range as the aircraft became visible. Tracers arced through the failing light, creating streams of fire that pilots had to fly through during their attack runs. Several Swordfish were hit by shell fragments but remained airborne. The fabric covering and open frame structure meant that shells often passed through without hitting critical components. A solid hit would destroy the fragile aircraft instantly, but near misses that would cripple metal monoplanes often caused only minor damage to the Swordfish. Torpedo release occurred at ranges under 1,000 yards, less than half a nautical mile, with aircraft at altitudes of 50 feet or less above the wavetops. The pilots aimed for the most favorable angles of attack, approaching the stern quarters where torpedo protection was inherently lighter than amidships. Bismarck maneuvered radically, heeling hard in emergency turns that created massive bow waves. Most torpedoes missed as the ship turned inside their running tracks. 2 torpedoes struck amidships with little effect. The heavy belt armor and internal anti-torpedo bulkheads absorbed the explosions without critical damage. 1 torpedo struck aft, near the stern where the hull narrowed and protection was necessarily lighter. The damage control log would later record the catastrophic result. Steering gear inoperable, rudders jammed approximately 12 degrees to port. Engineering efforts to free the mechanism or rig emergency steering systems failed completely. The damage was too extensive. Speed fell to approximately 7 knots as the ship could no longer maintain efficient propulsion. The vessel began describing large circles to port, unable to maintain any consistent course. Attempts to steer using differential propeller pitch alone proved ineffective in the heavy seas that continued to build through the night. Captain Lindemann's bridge notations documented the unfolding crisis hour by hour. A ship unable to steer could not evade attacks, could not flee toward safety, and could barely fight effectively. The turning circle increased catastrophically, several miles in diameter. German damage control parties worked desperately through the night in the flooded stern compartments, but the steering mechanism was wrecked beyond any possibility of shipboard repair. Divers attempted external access to the rudder mechanisms in heavy seas, risking their lives in near-freezing water. Nothing succeeded in restoring steering control. British ships closed throughout the night of the 26th to 27th. Destroyers from Tovey's force made torpedo attacks that were repelled by secondary battery fire, but the attacks demonstrated that Bismarck was now effectively trapped. The strategic situation had become terminal for the German battleship. By dawn on the 27th, British battleships would arrive within gun range of a target that could not maneuver to evade or optimize firing solutions. A 5,000-pound wooden fabric aircraft built by a company better known for making furniture had trapped a capital ship worth hundreds of millions of Reichsmarks and carrying irreplaceable strategic value for Germany's surface fleet. Atlantic Ocean, 48 degrees 10 minutes north, 16 degrees 12 minutes west, 27th of May 1941, 0847. HMS Rodney opened fire at approximately 25,000 yards, over 12 nautical miles. King George V engaged moments later, her 10 14-inch guns adding to the weight of fire. The morning was overcast with moderate seas continuing from the previous night's weather. Bismarck, still circling slowly and unable to steer, returned fire as soon as British ships came within range. Initial German salvos were remarkably accurate despite the steering damage, demonstrating the high quality of gunnery training and the effectiveness of fire control systems that continued to function. But without the ability to maneuver, Bismarck could not avoid incoming fire or optimize her own firing solutions by adjusting range and bearing. The ship was effectively a stationary target despite maintaining forward motion. Her circular track was predictable and easily plotted by British fire control computers. Rodney mounted 9 16-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, the most powerful armament in the Royal Navy. King George V carried 10 14-inch guns in an unusual arrangement of 1 quadruple and 2 twin turrets. Both ships possessed modern fire control systems with sophisticated rangefinders and mechanical computers that calculated ballistic solutions continuously. Admiral Tovey commanded the engagement from King George V's bridge. Captain Frederick Dalrymple Hamilton commanded Rodney directly. The British ships maneuvered freely, adjusting range and angle to optimize their gunnery, while minimizing exposure to German return fire. This freedom of movement provided an enormous tactical advantage. They could choose optimal firing positions while Bismarck could not. The engagement intensified rapidly over the first 30 minutes. Rodney closed aggressively to under 10,000 yards, less than 5 nautical miles, firing both main battery and 6-inch secondary guns at a target now well within effective range. Over the next 90 minutes, Rodney would fire approximately 380 main battery shells weighing over 1,000 pounds each, and more than 700 secondary rounds. King George V contributed hundreds more heavy shells from her 14-inch battery. The cumulative weight of fire was unprecedented in naval combat, several tons of steel and explosive arriving on target every minute. German turret crews fought their guns with professional skill as long as electrical power and fire control communications remained functional. British gunnery reports, compiled after the action, documented the progressive destruction with precise timestamps. Anton turret, the forwardmost main battery turret, was disabled by direct hits at approximately 0831. Bruno turret, the second forward turret, was knocked out shortly after by shells that penetrated the barbette and caused internal explosions. Caesar turret aft continued firing sporadically until approximately 0930 when power and fire control links were severed. Multiple direct penetrations smashed fire control positions, wrecked stereoscopic rangefinders, and severed communications cables between the bridge and gunnery stations throughout the ship. The ship began to list noticeably to port as water entered through shell holes opened below the waterline. Fires broke out in multiple compartments, fed by ruptured fuel lines and ignited ammunition. Speed decreased further as propeller shafts were damaged and steam lines to turbines were cut by shell fragments. British ships closed to point-blank range by modern battleship standards. At one point Rodney fired from under 3,000 yards, ranges more typical of cruiser actions than battleship engagements. At such close distances, even 6-inch secondary battery guns could penetrate Bismarck's deck and superstructure armor, creating cascading damage throughout the upper works. German gunnery proficiency, legendary in the Kriegsmarine, could not overcome the loss of mobility and the progressive destruction of fire control systems that coordinated the guns. British heavy shells arrived in unrelenting volume and weight. The accumulated damage removed offensive capability entirely by mid-morning. The ship was a floating wreck, listing heavily to port, on fire in multiple locations, unable to steer or maintain effective gunnery. Only scuttling charges or final torpedo attacks could ensure the ship sank rather than being captured as a prize. The last decision aboard Bismarck would be how to end the fight with whatever honor and defiance remained to the crew. Atlantic Ocean, 27th of May 1941, 10:15 hours. Chief Engineer Hans Oels and Damage Control Officer Gerhard Junak received orders to prepare scuttling procedures. German naval practice, developed over decades, included pre-fitted charges and specially designed valves throughout the lower hull. Systems designed to ensure rapid catastrophic flooding if capture became imminent. The crew had trained for this contingency during workup exercises in the Baltic. Damage control teams moved through the lower decks, opening seacocks and activating explosive charges positioned near machinery spaces, fuel bunkers, and forward and aft magazines. British expectation was that gunnery fire alone would sink the ship within a reasonable time. The volume and weight of fire seemed more than sufficient. Over 2,800 heavy shells had been fired at ranges varying from 25,000 yards down to under 3,000. Hundreds of hits had been observed and logged by spotters. The superstructure was completely wrecked. Fires raged throughout the upper works, and the list to port increased steadily as flooding continued. But the heavily armored citadel and hull, designed specifically to resist torpedo and heavy shell damage, remained structurally intact below the waterline despite the punishment. The heavy cruiser HMS Dorsetshire, which had been screening the battleships during the engagement, closed to torpedo range on orders from Admiral Tovey. At 10:36 hours, she fired two 21-inch torpedoes into Bismarck's starboard side from approximately 3,000 yards, point-blank range for a modern torpedo. Both weapons struck and detonated, opening additional large holes in the hull below the waterline. Dorsetshire then maneuvered around to the port side, the side toward which Bismarck was already listing, and fired one more torpedo at 10:38, which also hit and exploded. The additional underwater damage combined with scuttling efforts and cumulative battle damage to accelerate the flooding catastrophically. Bismarck capsized to port at 10:39 hours and sank stern first by 10:40 hours. The final position was logged precisely at 48 degrees 10 minutes north, 16 degrees 12 minutes west, approximately 300 nautical miles west of Brest and 400 miles south of the southern tip of Ireland. Of the approximately 2,200 officers and men aboard at the start of the engagement, perhaps 800 to 1,000 survived the sinking itself and entered the water. The North Atlantic in late May was cold enough that survival time without rescue measured in hours at most. Dorsetshire and the destroyer HMS Maori began immediate rescue operations, pulling men from the oil-covered sea. The water was littered with debris, life rafts, and swimmers in various states of exhaustion and hypothermia. Rescue crews worked as quickly as conditions permitted, but the rough seas and oil slicks complicated the efforts. By 11:40 hours, approximately 110 men had been recovered and brought aboard the British ships. At 11:40 hours, a U-boat warning forced the British ships to withdraw immediately. German submarines were known to be operating in the area, and stationary ships conducting rescue operations presented ideal targets. The decision to abandon rescue efforts was operationally sound but left hundreds of German sailors still in the water. Admiral Tovey had no choice. He could not risk additional British ships and crews for men who were, ultimately, enemy combatants. Days later, the German weather observation ship Sachsenwald and submarine U-74 picked up 5 more survivors who had managed to stay alive in rafts. The final count was approximately 115 survivors from a crew of 2,200, a casualty rate exceeding 94%. The combination of cumulative gunnery damage measured in hundreds of shell hits, 3 torpedo hits from Dorsetshire, and deliberate scuttling by the German crew led to capsizing and sinking. Post-war analysis and multiple wreck surveys conducted decades later would confirm that scuttling contributed significantly to the final loss. Internal damage from open seacocks and detonated charges accelerated flooding beyond what external damage alone would have caused. Whether gunnery and torpedoes alone would have sunk the ship within a reasonable time frame remained debated among naval historians. What was absolutely clear: the ship was doomed the moment British heavy units arrived and steering control was lost. British rescue efforts had been genuine within the constraints of operational necessity, but those constraints forced abandonment of hundreds of men still floating in the cold Atlantic. The water temperature in late May at that latitude was cold enough that survival time for men without immersion suits measured in single-digit hours. Those not rescued within the first few hours died of hypothermia despite life jackets and rafts. With the wreck gone beneath 4,000 meters of water, attention across both navies shifted to the larger question of meaning. What had the 74-hour pursuit demonstrated about the future of naval warfare? London, 28th of May through June 1941. Post-action conferences assembled in the Admiralty buildings overlooking the Thames. Summary tables compiled by staff officers listed munitions expended and distances steamed by every participating unit. The pursuit had consumed 74 hours from initial contact in Denmark Strait to final sinking west of Brest. British forces had collectively steamed more than 3,000 nautical miles at speeds averaging 20 to 25 knots. An enormous expenditure of fuel oil. Approximately 2,800 heavy and medium shells had been fired during the final surface engagement alone. Over 250 aircraft sorties, including reconnaissance patrols, shadowing missions, and strike operations, had been flown by RAF Coastal Command and Fleet Air Arm units. First Sea Lord Pound reviewed the operational summaries in detail with Admiral Tovey, who had returned to Scapa Flow, and with Air Ministry liaison officers responsible for coordinating maritime air operations. Pre-war doctrine, developed through the 1920s and 30s, had emphasized decisive battleship actions, formal line engagements where superior gunnery accuracy and heavier armor protection would prove decisive. The Bismarck pursuit demonstrated a fundamentally different reality. Aircraft and radar-enabled search had been the truly decisive enabling factors. Surface gunnery remained necessary for the final destruction phase, but without aviation reconnaissance and the carrier strike that disabled steering, Bismarck would almost certainly have escaped to French ports. The resource diversion had been substantial by any measure. Multiple capital ships displacing 30,000 to 40,000 tons each had been pulled off convoy escort duties temporarily, leaving Atlantic convoys more vulnerable to U-boat attack during the critical 74-hour period. Fuel expenditure reached tens of thousands of tons across all participating units. Ammunition stocks at naval bases were significantly depleted. Yet the strategic result clearly justified the enormous cost. Bismarck's destruction removed Germany's most powerful operational surface unit and validated the aggressive concentration strategy that Churchill and Pound had insisted upon despite objections about leaving other areas exposed. The message sent to the German naval staff was unmistakably clear. British forces would concentrate overwhelmingly against any major surface threat, regardless of cost to other operations or risks to individual units. The Royal Navy possessed sufficient numerical superiority to mass multiple battleships, carriers, and supporting units against a single German raider, while still maintaining minimum coverage of other vital areas. Germany simply could not match that material advantage in surface units. Staff officers compiled detailed appreciation documents noting the critical contribution of each operational element in the successful hunt. Neutral observers in Swedish waters had provided the earliest warning of Bismarck's departure, giving British forces time to position for interception. Signals intelligence at Bletchley Park had narrowed search areas dramatically and predicted German intentions to make for France rather than Norway. Long-range reconnaissance aircraft, particularly the Catalina flying boats, had found the target after contact was lost and reacquisition seemed nearly impossible. Carrier strikes had disabled the target's ability to maneuver, ensuring that surface forces could close to engagement range. Surface gunnery had delivered the final destruction. Each element had been operationally necessary. No single element alone would have been sufficient to achieve success. One Admiralty staff note, circulated among senior officers in early June, crystallized the central lesson in a single sentence. Biplanes accomplished what battleships could not. The Swordfish strike on the evening of the 26th of May had cost approximately £75,000 in aircraft, torpedoes, and ordnance, a relatively modest sum. The battleship engagement on the morning of the 27th had expended millions of pounds in shells, fuel, and operational costs. Yet the obsolete-looking fabric-covered aircraft had delivered the single decisive blow. The torpedo hit that jammed Bismarck's steering and ensured her destruction by making escape impossible. The institutional implications were profound and would reshape Royal Navy priorities for the remainder of the war. The service had entered the conflict in September 1939 believing firmly in battleship supremacy and the decisive value of heavy gun surface actions. The destruction of Hood and the pursuit of Bismarck demonstrated conclusively that aircraft carriers and long-range maritime patrol aircraft had become the truly decisive weapon systems in modern naval warfare. Future construction priorities would reflect this strategic shift dramatically. Resources and shipyard capacity would flow increasingly toward aircraft carriers, escort carriers for convoy protection, and long-range maritime patrol aircraft rather than additional battleships whose construction times measured in years. If air-sea integration was the fundamental lesson of the Bismarck operation, what changes would occur inside the German Navy? Would senior commanders like Grand Admiral Raeder recognize the strategic shift that had occurred? Would they adapt German naval strategy and construction priorities accordingly? Or would they continue to invest scarce resources in surface raiders that could no longer operate effectively against an enemy that had mastered the operational integration of aircraft, surface forces, and signals intelligence into a coordinated system? Berlin Naval High Command, June through September 1941. Staff briefing charts displayed in the operations center showed planned surface operations now marked with red stamps reading "canceled" or "postponed indefinitely." Grand Admiral Erich Raeder reported directly to Adolf Hitler on the strategic implications of Bismarck's loss during a series of meetings at the Reich Chancellery. The fundamental calculation governing German surface operations had shifted dramatically and unfavorably. Surface commerce raiding, promising in theoretical planning, had proven operationally untenable against an enemy willing and materially able to concentrate overwhelming force at essentially any cost. The raw numbers told an unambiguous story. Germany had begun the war in September 1939 with a surface fleet far inferior to the Royal Navy in every category. Bismarck had represented the most powerful and modern unit in the entire Kriegsmarine, essentially irreplaceable given construction times measuring in years and severe resource constraints limiting naval shipbuilding. Her loss removed fully half of Germany's operational battleship strength in a single catastrophic engagement. Tirpitz, Bismarck's sister ship, remained the only modern German battleship, but naval staff were now deeply reluctant to risk her in offensive operations. Post-May 1941, planned sorties by heavy surface units into the Atlantic were systematically cancelled. Resources and strategic emphasis shifted dramatically toward the U-boat arm commanded by Admiral Karl Donitz. Monthly submarine production rates, already climbing through 1940 and early 1941, increased further as the Naval High Command redirected industrial capacity and raw materials toward undersea warfare. The strategic logic was clear. Submarines could operate more freely, could not be hunted as systematically as surface ships, and presented targeting challenges that British forces had not yet solved effectively. A confidential memorandum from Raeder to Hitler in late June 1941 acknowledged the harsh reality in characteristically understated language. Further offensive operations by heavy surface units present untenable operational risks, given demonstrated British capability to concentrate superior forces. The document represented a fundamental admission that Germany's surface fleet strategy had failed decisively. Prestige units like Tirpitz would be retained as fleet in being threats that tied down British resources through their mere existence, but would not be risked in offensive Atlantic operations. The legacy of Hood's catastrophic loss and Bismarck's destruction would be measured not in tactical analyses but in industrial priorities and strategic resource allocation. From mid-1941 forward, Germany's naval war against Britain would be fought primarily beneath the surface by expanding wolfpack tactics and increasing submarine production. The age of the surface raider in the Atlantic, brief and never particularly successful, had ended definitively in the cold waters 400 miles west of Brest. London, 1948 Post-War Review, North Atlantic Wreck Surveys, late 20th century. A Royal Navy summary document prepared for the official naval history listed human losses and operational metrics for the public historical record. The numbers carried weight beyond their statistical precision. Each figure represented individual lives, families destroyed, and sacrifice on both sides that should never be minimized or forgotten. HMS Hood casualties, 1,418 lost, 3 survivors. Bismarck casualties, approximately 2,085 lost, 115 survivors. The pursuit itself consumed 74 hours of continuous operations. The fatal gunnery engagement phase lasted under 2 hours. The single decisive event that made final destruction possible. One torpedo hit jamming the steering gear, delivered by an obsolete biplane in heavy weather and failing light. The operational cost to Britain was substantial but strategically justified. Extensive fleet diversion pulled major units from other duties for over 3 days. Fuel expenditure across all participating forces totaled tens of thousands of tons. Ammunition stocks were depleted significantly, but the strategic gain was clear and lasting. Complete end of German surface raiding in the Atlantic for the duration of the war. After Bismarck's loss, no German heavy unit would seriously threaten Atlantic convoy routes again. Tirpitz would spend the war in Norwegian fjords, a threat that never materialized into offensive action. An Admiralty Review document prepared in 1948 for the official naval history included a notable assessment. No single ship in naval history has ever compelled such concentration of force against it. The statement was factually accurate. The pursuit involved 2 aircraft carriers, 6 battleships and battlecruisers, 13 cruisers, 21 destroyers, and 6 submarines across British and Allied forces. Multiple aircraft types flew hundreds of sorties. The mobilization represented nearly every available major unit in the Atlantic theater simultaneously. Technical surveys of the wreck site conducted in 1989 and later expeditions using deep-sea submersibles confirmed damage patterns and provided evidence supporting scuttling claims. Internal damage from open seacocks and detonated charges was clearly visible in the wreck's remains 4,000 meters below the surface. The surveys validated both the intensity of British gunnery, hundreds of shell impacts documented across the wreck, and German damage control efforts to ensure the ship sank rather than being captured. The fundamental lesson, clear to naval analysts even in 1941, became doctrine by war's end. Carrier aviation combined with long-range reconnaissance and signals intelligence had created the decisive system for naval warfare. Battleships would continue to serve valuable roles providing gunfire support and air defense, but they would never again be considered the primary striking arm of naval power. The template established during the Bismarck pursuit, integrated operations combining surface, air, and intelligence elements, became standard practice for Atlantic warfare through 1945. One torpedo from a wood and fabric aircraft, delivered at twilight in heavy seas by a pilot flying at 90 knots, had fixed a course that battleship guns worth millions of pounds could not alter. The torpedo pointed directly toward the carrier age that would dominate naval warfare for the next 50 years. Technology built in the previous war proved that the current war belonged to aircraft, not ships of the line. The numbers endure in archives and memorials. 1,418 men lost aboard Hood in 8 minutes, 2,085 lost aboard Bismarck over 74 hours of pursuit. The human cost of the engagement exceeded 3,500 lives across both navies. Behind each number stood families who received telegrams, children who grew up without fathers, and communities that mourned losses for decades. The technological lesson proved equally enduring. Industrial capacity, reconnaissance capability, and integrated operations combining multiple domains. These factors determined outcomes more decisively than armor thickness or gun caliber. A 5,000-pound fabric-covered biplane, designed when many of its pilots were children, delivered the blow that trapped a 50,000-ton battleship representing the pinnacle of naval engineering. The strategic implications reshaped naval warfare globally. Surface ships would never again operate independently as decisive instruments of sea control. The integration of air search, carrier strikes, signals intelligence, and surface gunnery established the pattern that all navies would follow through the remainder of the 20th century. The pursuit demonstrated that material superiority combined with operational integration could overcome individual technical advantages. What remains beyond statistics and strategic analysis is memory. The sailors who fought aboard Hood, Bismarck, Rodney, King George V, Ark Royal, and dozens of other ships served their nations according to their oaths and training. Courage was displayed on all sides, by British cruiser crews maintaining contact under fire, by German damage control parties working in flooded compartments, by swordfish pilots flying into curtains of anti-aircraft fire, by rescue crews pulling exhausted men from freezing water. The human dimension transcends national narratives or claims of supremacy. The 74-hour pursuit from Denmark Strait to the final action west of Brest compressed the evolution of naval warfare into 3 days. It demonstrated the end of one era and the beginning of another. The battleship age, which had dominated naval thinking since HMS Dreadnought in 1906, gave way to the carrier age that would define the Pacific War and Cold War naval operations for decades. One torpedo, delivered in the worst possible conditions by an obsolete aircraft, marked that transition point more clearly than any theoretical analysis could have done. What is your perspective on this part of history? Share your thoughts in the comments, because every memory and reflection helps keep the past alive.